Hey there everybody, my name is Kat Bowser. I'm your resident fantasy therapist and welcome back to my channel. Those of you here for the first time, welcome. My name is Kat Bowser. I'm a licensed therapist. I'm also a writer working on my first novel. And on my channel I like to dig into what I consider to be the heart of all writing, and that is the characters. And the heart of the characters lies in their psychology. So that's the angle that I take with everything we're going to discuss on my channel. So today we are continuing my trope diagnosis series. This is where I take a popular writing trope and I dig into kind of the nuances and the psychology behind it. So last month I talked about all my favorite tropes, or well, not all of them, but some of my favorite tropes. This month I decided to do requested tropes, which is great because I love getting trope ideas from you guys. So if you guys have any that you want to drop on this video, feel free and I will get to them as soon as I can. So for this video, Divine Wrath actually asked for this one, and that is we're going to be talking about Break the Cutie. Okay, so this trope, Break the Cutie, is probably one of the more popular ones. I see it all the freaking time. I personally don't mind it. I like it if it's done well. But there is more to it, I think, than most people really consider. So that's what we're going to talk about here. So Break the Cutie trope, actually, in my opinion, there's three parts to it. First off, you have to have the character or the cutie, which is generally a character who is very naive and very innocent. In a lot of stories, this is going to be either a child character or a character that has very childlike qualities. So someone who is very trusting and kind of kind to everyone, looks for the good in everyone, that kind of thing. The second part of this trope is the breaking. This is where typically the villain, occasionally it's just life, but usually it's the villain, gets a hold of this character and utterly breaks their spirit, usually through torture, death, killing people that are close to them, things like that. And then the third part is the character's response, which can vary drastically depending on what you're going to do. So honestly, the key point of this trope is talking about trauma. This trope is essentially talking about what trauma does to people. So I think that's kind of the best way to look at this. So first off, let's just take the character in the beginning. So most of the time, like I said, this is a very naive character with childlike qualities. So we can look at what children generally are like. And usually, like I said, this character has a very naive and well-intentioned view of the world. They generally have this idea of good is always going to win, people are good people, that sort of thing. So when we are young, we develop what we call schemas of the world. And what this is essentially, as we learn about things, we put them into specific categories in our mind. So like, for example, a child that is raised, let's say, with cats in their family. When they're a kid, they know that an animal that is furry and has 4 legs and a tail and is a cat. But when they first see a dog, they're also going to call it a cat. Until they are told, no, if it has 4 legs, a tail, and says bark, it's a dog, not a cat. And then they say, okay, I'm going to add some clarifications to this category. And then they start to refine the categories that they put things into. This is kind of the same idea of how people view the world. We call this in therapy a core belief, which is basically, if you get down to it, how you view the world as a whole. So as a child, it's usually something along the lines of the world is good and people are good. I'll just use that as an example because I think that works really well with this trope in general. So, what happens when you go through trauma? Well, essentially, once we have gone through trauma, this core belief is shook because it no longer makes sense. So if you think about it, if you have this core belief that people are good and the world is good, but then you've been put through some torturous experience, they no longer mesh. They don't make sense anymore. How can the world be good if you've been put through this horrific experience? So the brain has to fix this. And if it doesn't fix it, you have essentially a ton of anxiety because what you've been through and what your brain is telling you about the world do not make sense. They don't compute. So you have to fix it. Unfortunately, one of the ways that the brain fixes this is it changes the core belief, but a lot of times what it does is it overgeneralizes it. And the reason it does that is because when we go through any traumatic experience, our brain essentially puts a bookmark in it. You know how you can bookmark websites and stuff on the internet. Your brain's kind of doing the same thing with a traumatic experience. It says, I need to remember details about this so I can make sure it doesn't happen again. Now, obviously, we know that sometimes traumatic experiences happen no matter what you do. It's unfortunate, but that's just how it is. But the brain doesn't see it that way. The brain sees it as this thing happened to me that put me in an unsafe position. I need to figure out what the warning signs were so that it doesn't happen again. So this is why you get people who suddenly they can't go down a certain street, or they become nervous once it gets dark, or sometimes even things like, let's say you were attacked around a place that smelled like pizza, and now you can't stand the smell of pizza because that triggers those memories. That's what your brain is doing. It's trying to protect you, but it's overdoing it. And what also happens, particularly with PTSD, is essentially when your brain is in a traumatic experience, it flips into survival mode. That's the adrenaline, fight, flight, or freeze. And when that happens, oh boy, your brain is trying to, like I said, its core purpose is to try to keep you alive. So whenever we're put in a traumatic experience, a dangerous situation, our brain, in like microseconds, and less than that, honestly, is determining, okay, do I need to fight? Do I need to flee? Or if I cannot do either of those things, I'm going to freeze. And that is actually from, we think, very long time ago, like when hunters and gatherers, is if you froze in like the path of a wild animal or something and it thought you were dead, it might leave you alone. So that's where we believe that comes from. Anyway, when it comes to trauma in terms of PTSD, what we really believe happens is that most of the time when you go through trauma, the trauma happens, it's over, and then you have to process it and work through it, but then it's done. What happens with PTSD is the brain does not recognize the trauma's done. Essentially, think of it as a little switch. When your brain is flipped to survival mode, when PTSD happens, it gets stuck in survival mode, and your brain has not recognized the danger has passed. I can relax, I can work on working through this, and I can move on with my life. Because this is something I like to bring up a lot, because a lot of times in stories, any character that goes through a traumatic experience gets PTSD. This is not true. Only about 15% of people that go through trauma get PTSD. And there's different reasons for it, but it all relates to the specific personality traits, supports they may have, all kinds of things. But in this circumstance, it doesn't mean that your character is not going to have a reaction to the trauma. It just means that it may not stick. So, for example, there's actually, when someone's gone through a traumatic experience, there's two disorders that we really look for. One is PTSD, but one is acute stress disorder. And they look extremely similar. The main difference is acute stress disorder will disappear by itself within a month's time. A lot of times people don't even have to really do therapy. They just kind of process it on their own and then they move on with their life. PTSD stays with you. It used to be, we used to have the terms that you either had acute PTSD or you had chronic PTSD, and acute was generally viewed as PTSD that eventually went away, and chronic stayed with you. We don't use those terms anymore because we typically view it as someone that has PTSD, as far as we know, will always have it, but we can kind of get the symptoms into what I would call oh, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to say regression. Oh, I can't think of the word, but we get it so the symptoms are not present. They're not really intervening with your life, but you still have to be kind of on your guard to make sure that they don't pop up again, so that you can be aware. Okay, here's things that trigger me. Here are techniques I've learned that help me work through those triggers, so I need to work on that and do that. So that's kind of what's going on with Break the Cutie, is essentially the character is going through trauma. And how your character handles the trauma is where the third part of this trope comes in. Because usually I see generally two versions. One, the character decides, okay, I'm not gonna be a victim. I'm gonna get stronger. I'm gonna become a warrior. I'm gonna fight back. That's one version. The other is what they call the blue screen of death, which comes from when your computer used to fail and it would go completely blue. That's where that term comes from, which is essentially where they completely break down and they just freeze, they stop really processing. And I don't think that either one of those is entirely correct. Now, the person wanting to get better and improve, yes, that does happen. But it doesn't happen instantaneously after a trauma. There's this process that books usually leave out, and that is the processing of the trauma. Just so you guys are aware, I use a specific trauma processing program when I'm working with someone who has trauma of any kind, and it is a 12-step process, and it usually takes about a year to a year and a half, and that's if the person is willing to go through each step one after the other. And that's not usually what happens. Usually you work through one, but then you may have an instance where memories are brought up, or you encounter your past abuser or something like that. And so you slide back a little bit, and we have to work on that and then move forward again. And that's just the process. That's just how it works. It doesn't mean that one person is stronger than another or anything like that. It just means that each person is unique and each person is different. So what I like to see, what I want to see more in books, is the process, or at least a passing of time. If you don't want to go into the person actually delving into their trauma and dealing with it, I can see why, because I think it's very hard to get right. But I also think that in some stories, that's just not generally what the focus is. So if you want to do a time skip and just mention that the person has been working with someone or has been processing their thoughts and things like that, I think that's fine. But I don't like to see when someone has gone through trauma that there is no reaction at all. There's just, they break down, they have like what they call their little freeze moment, and then they're completely back to normal. That's not how this works. The other part of this trope is usually what happens is the cutie, so to speak, has been so broken that their entire viewpoint on life is completely shifted. While I can see that as a possibility, that's not completely what happens. In therapy, what we generally do is we have people address their core belief, and a lot of times what you find is a core belief is usually beginning in absolutes. The world is all good. People are all good. After you've been through a trauma, the world is dangerous. It's not safe. People are all bad. These are all very black and white. So what we want to introduce is this concept of gray. So the world can be dangerous, but I can take steps to protect myself. For example, that's just one example. And that introduces this idea of if something bad happens, it doesn't completely destroy your core belief. It can still make sense. So you don't have this anxiety and this fear that you have to deal with every single time something happens. So, I think that's really Break the Cutie in a nutshell. It's basically trauma. it's essentially trauma. And like I said, I think this is a good trope. You can make it work. I think it's a really good idea to use it to kind of show how the character and their relationships to other people or their own internal strengths can help them rise up and work through what they've been through. But again, you have to be careful with it. I think anytime you're going to talk about trauma in a story, you need to be careful with it. Because everybody reacts to trauma differently. It affects different people differently. It shows up differently. Sometimes it doesn't show up for months. Sometimes it shows up almost instantaneously. And like I said, not everybody gets PTSD. Doesn't mean you're not going to have a reaction. Just means you don't have PTSD. So, just for the sake of clarity here, I'm going to give you guys the diagnosis protocol for PTSD as of right now. Okay, so I'm going to read this off because as much as I see PTSD in my work, I do not have this memorized because it's complex. So here we go. So this applies to anyone 6 years or older. For 6 years who are younger, we have a different protocol for it. So basically, you have exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways: directly experiencing the event, witnessing in person the event, learning that the event occurred to a close family member or close friend. In cases of actual or threatened death of a family member or friend, the events must have been violent or accidental. Experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to adverse details of the traumatic event, such as first responders collecting human remains, police officers exposed to details of child abuse, etc., etc. Section B, presence of one or more of the following intrusion symptoms associated with traumatic events beginning after the traumatic event occurred: recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories. In children older than 6 years, repetitive play may occur in which themes or aspects of the traumatic event are expressed. In children, there may be frightening dreams without recognizable content. Dissociative reactions, such as flashbacks in which the individual feels or acts as if the traumatic event was reoccurring. In children, traumatic specific reenactment may occur in play. Intense or prolonged psychological distress, exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. Marked physiological reactions to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. Section C, persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the traumatic events beginning after the traumatic event, as evidenced by one or both of the following: avoidance of or efforts to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings or closely associated with traumatic events, avoidance of or efforts to avoid external reminders, people, places, conversations, activities, objects, such situations that arouse distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings. Section D, negative alterations in cognition and mood associated with the traumatic event beginning or worsening after the traumatic event occurred, as evidenced by two or more of the following: inability to remember an important aspect of the traumatic events, typically due to dissociative amnesia and not to other factors such as head memory, alcohol, etc. Let's see. Persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself or the world. I am bad, no one can be trusted, etc. Persistent, distorted cognitions about the cause or consequence of the events. Persistent negative emotional state, fear, horror, anger, guilt. Marked diminished interest or participation in significant activities, feelings of detachment or estrangement from others, persistent inability to experience positive emotions, inability to experience happiness, satisfaction, or loving feelings. Section E, marked alterations in arousal and reactivity associated with traumatic events beginning or worsening after the event occurred, as evidenced by two or more of the following: irritable behavior and angry outbursts with little or no provocation, typically expressed as verbal or physical aggression towards people or objects, reckless or self